So,
Oh, Larry.
I know this is a lot, but don't worry, I've been doing the research.
Oh, Larry.
What do you mean, Larry?
Yeah, well, a lot has happened in a week. You died, I died, I just been reunited with both of my dead husbands.
You're exactly how I dreamt you.
Ooh. And I have to pick where to spend eternity.
My client clearly has a very difficult decision to make.
Yeah.
Longest Theater 3000, and Matt Castro, am sitting here in Colorado. And Bill, where are you?
In Guangzhou, China.
Guangzhou, China. I've never been to China. Is the pollution bad?
You're not missing much.
Yeah. Maybe one day. But I don't really have a major desire to go there. It's kind of low on my list of places to go. But glad you could jump on and talk about a movie you picked. So I have to ask you, why did you pick? Well, let me do this. Let me read the synopsis, and then I'll ask you the question. So we're doing the film Eternity, which came out in 2025 on Apple. I think is where I was able to watch it. It was Apple TV. Quick synopsis here. Eternity is a fantasy romantic comedy. You don't usually see those three words together. It's set in an afterlife where souls get 1 week to decide where they will spend eternity. Joan arrives and faces an impossible choice: remain with her long-term husband of 65 years, Larry, the husband she spent her life with, or reunite with Luke, her first husband, her first love that she lost when he died young, who has waited decades for her. The movie turns that setup into a meditation on love, grief, memory, regret, and whether human relationships can bear the weight of forever. Whoa. There you go. So why did you pick this movie? Why did you want to talk about it?
Yeah, so I saw this movie on a flight, had never heard of it or seen anything about it, but it looked interesting, so I watched this going from LA to Hong Kong a few weeks ago. But I thought it was really interesting to me because it raised some questions about why do we get married? What happens to our marriages when we die? You know, there's plenty of people, widows and widowers, that remarry, and what does the Bible say about that? Because this movie had some. I don't think it was necessarily condemning remarriage, but I was kind of curious about what the Bible says about that. I think there's some interesting practical application to our faith, in relation to the message this movie sends.
Yeah, it's I can't remember the last time I watched a rom-com. Right, they're not as popular nowadays, probably because they don't make a lot of movies that go into theater anymore. But it definitely, like, one thing, it definitely felt like The Good Place, which I know both of us have talked about, would like to talk about on this podcast, because it's a unique show, very philosophical. This show in some ways is inspired, I think, by that premise. And A25 is the production company, which is kind of become a very popular kind of indie film company.
I don't know much about it.
Yeah, so A24 has done a lot of really interesting movies, and they've become probably more well known now than they have when they first started making movies. I think like in maybe the early 2010s. But they did a movie which we would have to do on this podcast because it is a weird but very interesting movie. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. Did you ever watch that movie?
I think I've heard of it. I don't think I've seen it.
So it won Best Picture in 2024, 2023. And it's it is an interesting movie that A24 made, and talks about some big ideas. This movie starts off. Great scene with the old Volvo. You gotta love old Volvo station wagons. My grandmother had one of those back in the day, and an old couple. They go to is it a gender reveal party? That's where they're going, right? I think that's where they're going. and the husband Larry, and his long-term wife Joan, he chokes on a pretzel and dies, and then wakes up on a train, and then is dropped off in this kind of what's called the junction, is the proper term of what it is. And basically, I mean, is this probably fair to say? It's basically like it's a waiting place into the afterlife. It almost, I guess, it's somewhat like purgatory. I guess it's kind of a quasi
I
purgatory.
think that was kind of the symbolism they were looking for, probably.
He dies. His wife has cancer, and so he kind of basically waiting for her to die to be with him. But there are these officers called the Afterlife coordinators who basically help them in this week to pick an eternity. And I'll have to ask, like, what was some of the ones that basically it's almost like a job fair, right? I mean, like there's brochures.
It felt that way. Yeah, they're all kind of selling their afterlife.
Exactly. And there's like, as they look over like their kind of junction hotel like balcony, there's all these booths everywhere, and that's like basically people selling these different versions of the afterlife. Were there any one of them that you? I wrote a lot of the ones that I saw. I actually missed the one that you liked the most. I didn't catch that one. But what was your favorite one?
Well, I mean, I'm sure the writers had a lot of fun being creative, like picking these things. But it was either like Stamp World or Coin World or something, and the passions that these people have in life, they're going to pursue in death. But that is the first point where you kind of think about what eternity is, because a person could have a lifelong hobby, 60, 70, 80 years worth of something, and then but to think about like forever in that hobby, like really changes like how important that is to you. So I thought that was neat. It forces the people who are dead to really consider what's important to them.
Yeah, again, I guess to explain, so basically the premise of the story is you had to pick one of these afterlives, and whatever one you picked within this 1 week, like these 7 days, you have to spend eternity there.
Right.
And no going back. And like it's like this point being made, like if you left, like if you would be basically caught and put in. They said the void, which is basically hell. They don't, but they clearly say there is no hell. But it's like,
I probably they're trying to be sensitive to people who have all sorts of beliefs about what happens when you die. And so that's the most generic, non-triggering version of things they can come up with, right? They don't want to like associate the stigma of a particular label with it. So it's not hell, but
I mean, even the characters like, so Larry is played by Miles Taylor. He's basically like, that's hell, right? Like they kind of like they like quickly cut a job at that. But there's like all these different, you can do the mountain afterlife is a prominent one in the story, and then the beach one, and like the paradise, But there are some pretty funny ones, and I think they did a really good job of like leaning into the comedy of that. Like I think that was the most comedic thing. There's two that I thought were the best. There's Studio 54, and it said like with no age. That was pretty. I caught that one, and then the Vilmar Afterlife, but with 100% no Nazis. So it's like the 1930s in Germany, but with no Nazis. So that was pretty. That was pretty funny. It was very creative. I thought they did a really good job of making those pretty light in a pretty morbid movie. It's pretty dark, which I don't know if you noticed. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
No, continue.
But it's a dark theme. I mean, they're dead.
Yeah.
But they did definitely lighten it up. But I wanted to ask, like, before we get into some of these like bigger questions, did you notice how much alcohol was drank in the movie?
I mean, they spent some time in the bar for sure.
And there's like this scene where her and her friend Karen, after she dies, is there. They like go on a drunker, and like, and I was thinking about that. I was like, if you were fully conscious and you were in this moment where you had to make this tough decision, and alcohol was available, I can see why you would drink a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
Take some of the stress off of that decision, perhaps. I don't know.
absolutely. What was your kind of favorite scene in the movie?
Well, I don't have one particular favorite scene. There were a couple that I thought about later that I enjoyed. One was kind of you know, uh, Larry is on his way to the world he chooses, and he's got his floaties and everything, and he passes his wife going the other direction, and like whoa, he has a moment of realization and spins around and runs back. And then there's also that uncomfortable tension when he realizes that his bartender is who his bartender is. That was pretty good.
That was pretty good. I kind of saw it coming. I mean, obviously,
Uh,
like when when her and her first husband do like the archives, you're just kind of
yeah,
waiting for the sex scene to arrive, and then it immediately
yeah,
arrives. So like,
yeah.
you're kind of wondering like when that was gonna happen. Like you've got a guy who's waited 50 plus years for his first
Yes.
wife to come back. Like you could
Yeah,
definitely like sense the like sexual tension. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, I think that like when he first like goes on a date with her, like I was just thinking like what would I be thinking at that particular moment when my wife that I've waited so long to shows up, and like she's young and beautiful, and just the
Yeah.
kind of like the tension that he probably definitely has.
Hey,
What
was well, I want to ask you, was it interesting to you that the moral code shifts a little bit? Because if you remember, the bartender first husband has a few dalliances while he's waiting for her, but everyone kind of excuses that because, oh, I mean, that's reasonable. And
but the
I
letter
think,
was somehow like completely like
yeah.
awful. Right.
So I thought that was kind of interesting. They kind of excuse that because, like, why wouldn't he?
Why
But
wouldn't
if it were in like the real world, he'd be condemned for that.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, I think that's a good point because you watch that. There's and it like it was pretty like there were some things like obviously he had like a homosexual experience
oh, I
that
forgot
was
about that.
mentioned. Yeah, that was mentioned. And she's like, kind of, oh yeah, of course. Why wouldn't you? And while you're waiting, basically, to kind of help you if you've never seen the movie, her first husband who died in the Korean War, which I think that may be my favorite quote in that movie, when
Oh,
he's
yeah,
like, well, he died in the Korean War. Like that wasn't one of the like important ones, and that
yeah.
was kind of a running
Yeah,
gag.
that reminded me of the scene from uh, oh, what's the one where they go to Vegas for the weekend before the wedding? Uh, Go ahead.
Hangover.
Yeah, the Hangover, where they're in the Caesar's Palace checking in, and the guy's like, "Oh, I've got my reservation for Doctor So and So," and he goes, "Hold on, like he's a dentist. Like if someone has an emergency, you should still call 911."
It's a good running gag through that whole movie. It was like, well, he died during the Korean War. That wasn't
Yeah.
like, and even one of the guys when they went to the mountain, they go, "Oh, he died in the war. Oh, which one? One or two?" And he's like, the Korean one." That was pretty good. Because you could definitely like the competition between the two men as they're like basically now in this situation they're trying to like compete for her heart, and
Mhm.
one was her first love, and one she
Yeah.
was married to for 65 years, right? And so they're
Hmm.
competing. So he's like a war hero. He's a war hero, but how do I drop him down some pegs? Oh, he died in the Korean War. That's like
Oh,
that's
yeah,
not very special.
it's the forgotten war. I'm going to South Korea tonight, actually.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's a war that's never end, right? There's the
Well, yeah, they got the DMZ up there, and yeah, no, I just don't remember learning much about the Korean War when I was in school. It kind of glossed over it, right? I'm sure you had the similar experience.
which if we ever do House of Dynamite, we'll have to talk about the Korean War if you've not seen it, because that
Mm.
North Korea pops up in that movie, which is a pretty intense movie that we'll have to that we'll have to do at some point. I think it came out maybe last year on Netflix. So like, let's, basically there's a lot to talk about. Obviously it's not a Christian worldview movie. I mean, it's not depicting like a proper understanding of the afterlife and these things at all. But it does provide some interesting questions, and we'll have to talk about which at some point, like I don't know when in the movie you kind of like it kind of stumps you. You're like, whoa, this is like someone who wrote a story and like read that passage in Matthew 22. Like, what happens if there's a woman who has like 7 husbands and they go to the afterlife? Who is she married to? Like, it actually is like takes that question that the Pharisees had of Jesus and basically presents a story or a movie behind it. I don't think that was the intention of the screenwriter or the director, but I definitely like halfway through the movie, like it kind of hit me in the head. I'm like, whoa, this is exactly what the Pharisees were asking. So I have a few questions to kind of throw at you, and we can talk about some of these segments. But basically, like, what is what ultimately is real? So, what kind of universe does this film believe in? Is the kind of the first question.
Yeah. So I'd say that like if you look at the presuppositions of the people writing it, of probably most of the people watching it, they're taking their experience of the real world and sticking it in the afterlife. So like the imagery of the train depot, the choices we have with regard to our responsibility as humans for doing like that certainly asks a question about are we the masters of our own destiny, or is there a higher power that's in control of things, but it unless you have kind of a really even I would say a sovereign God type of worldview, divorced from our experience as people, just going about our day. It kind of applies what we experience every day into the afterlife, and I don't think that's probably where it deviates from the Christian worldview. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think which you mentioned it when we were talking before we started. Like, God is not mentioned at all. Religion is. I mean, one question was said about later. I guess you are religious, and there is this kind of idea that religion is a part of people's perspective about from life, and then also into the afterlife. But God is never mentioned. There's an individual called Kevin who's like the upper boss,
upper management.
upper management. They had to ask him for permission for kind of a scenario, which ended up being
it's a very bureaucratic afterlife.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of similar to like the Loki show, but like I don't know if you caught this too, but I'm like, this is actually Bachelorette if it was in the afterlife. Like, they went on a date in Mountain Land, and then they went on a date in Beach Land, and it was like, what rose is she going to accept? Tonight, that kind of thing. But like one thing that I think is consistent with Scripture is that the soul is eternal. I mean, you definitely get that in eternity. Like, there is, basically the soul continues, and there's a consciousness that they remember their life. They don't. It doesn't seem like they have a lot of regrets. That there are sufferings, like a wife losing her husband and her husband dying in war. Like, that's clearly part of the storyline. But they don't have like any kind of major regrets or like major mistakes that they made in life that's brought up in this. They don't have any moment of like meditation on their life where they're like asking for forgiveness or even trying to change at all, right?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. That kind of raises a worldview that I have a little bit of beef with, that I hear a lot of, which is the one you hear where people say like, "Oh, I don't regret any of my mistakes. Like, it's made me the person I am today." And I think if you are, trying to have any sort of repentant attitude towards sin, you should regret your sin, and it seems like that approach of like, I don't regret the things that I've done because they made me who I am today, really kind of averts accountability for the things that you've done, because we've all done terrible things, some worse than others, but if you are placing your trust in Christ and trying to turn from sin, then by definition, don't you, regret doing the things that are offensive to God?
Right.
And this movie, while I loved it, I thought it was really entertaining. Um, Kind of minimizes that. There's no accountability for wrong things that the people do in life. Um, that to me was interesting.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I don't. I think it was mentioned. I don't know if I caught the exact quote, but one of the afterlife coordinators, Anna was her name. They made a comment about everyone goes to the afterlife, meaning everyone goes through the junction, regardless if you were, I'm guessing, Hitler or Gandhi, right? I
Yeah,
guess that's the proper way to say. Everyone goes through the junction, and they get to choose what afterlife they want. There is no kind of like, well, you were Hitler, you killed millions
mm,
of people. You have these
yeah,
choices. Like it wasn't. There was
yeah.
no really sense of justice. It was
Well,
good or
that
bad. Because I think that was the quote. They said, I guess the whole like living a good life is kind of a meaningless concept. They said that in the movie.
Well, it's interesting too because it kind of gives you some insight into the worldview of the director or whoever wrote the movie. That from their perspective, morality might be relative or subjective, and I hear that a lot from the guys that I fly with. There's an adamant opinion from probably the majority of people I encounter, that morality is not objective, that there is no right and wrong, um, and I think it's a flawed worldview, and I love having the conversation with people about it. Um, but I think that there's logically some problems with a relative morality, and this movie treats that as a presupposition.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I will say on the front end, David Freiney is the director. He also is the co-writer of this movie. I've never heard of this director before. Elizabeth Olsen is Joan. She's probably, I guess, the main character. She really is the focal of the story because
Yeah,
she has to make this choice about,
yeah,
is she going to spend eternity with her first husband who died in the war,
mm,
or her long-term husband of 65 years, right?
yeah,
And so she's kind of at the center of the story, and can't make a decision. I think that's
right.
that's a good prominent theme. So another, as we talk about, I mean, God is really not a part of the storyline at all. There's no judge, there's no karma at all. Like you said, there's no morality. It's very relative. So what is this? What is the movie saying about humans? What is it? Does the movie think a person really is?
Yeah. So I think the way I interpreted that was that a person might be just like the whole collection of how they feel about things. Like feelings is probably the kind of the arbiter for right and wrong.
Yeah.
Feelings is the gauge for success or not success. And anything that was posed as really right or wrong was essentially how a person felt about it. And I think we see that all over the place today. It's a reflection of our culture's view on right and wrong, but it's just the sum of a person's experience is what it is.
Yeah, I think that what I noticed about the movie, all that we know is that Joan was a librarian in life.
Mm,
We don't learn at all. I don't remember what Larry did, like what his profession was. Like I don't remember that it was ever stated.
yeah,
Like what people did, like people were not defined by what they accomplished in life at
yeah,
all. Like that wasn't really,
mm,
I love. Larry because he was a great plumber. Like, none of that was ever mentioned or anything like that. So you really don't know much about the individual other than their romantic life. That's all we really know about these characters. So love, romantic love, is like very much. Even the children aren't really discussed. They talk about, we had 2 children together, but not really all that much about them as parents or how they. That just was not a part of the storyline. It was really just about their like romantic love and how they fell in love. That was pretty much more the prominent thing. So like romantic love is such a prominent like identity, and even to a point where like the afterlife, which goes back to like God not being a part of it, is like who you're going to spend eternity with was such the prominent storyline. Is it going to be your first husband or your second husband? Like that's all that mattered. Even the afterlife they picked was not that significant. It was like who they were going to spend it to.
I think the characters were necessarily kind of self-centered. If you think about from a Christian perspective, it seems like Christianity is very much focused on your relationship to others, and didn't C.S. Lewis say not to think less of yourself, but to think of yourself less, and every decision and interaction and conflict that comes up, it kind of arises out of the fact that everyone is just concerned about themselves.
And it seems like the men, their idol was her. Like, and she was such the most prominent thing about.
She was the prize.
She was the prize, and I don't think it was necessarily like the competition was the prize. Like we just want to be winners. Then he does a little bit of it, but it really is like she was an idol, like to these men's affection and attention, and so even willing to like give her up out of the sake of like out of love for her or this matter or that matter. So so I think that does speak to like what humans are. It's like, well, who do you love? Like what is your love?
That's an interesting point, because when it came to that point of the story where Larry says, you know what, go with Luke. It's kind of he loves her, so he'll do what's best for her. Does that sound a little bit like the story in the Bible where there's the 2 women fighting over the baby, and the judge says, hey, we'll cut the baby in half, each get half, and the one says, no, take the baby. Like that sounded a little bit like that. Like that story.
Yeah, I think so too. You were the happiest when you were with him, so therefore go with Luke. This kind of thing. One question is, what is wrong with the world? Like basically, what's broke? Would you say in the story?
So what is wrong with the world in this story, or in our lives?
And like, what is the story saying? Is it saying that the world is broken?
Well, yeah, I think we can all agree that the world is broken. It's human corruption. You can't underestimate the impact of that. If there was no brokenness in the world, then we wouldn't have the story, the conflict in the story of who's she going to go with. That I think that all stems from the brokenness of people.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, number one, there's death. Like death is a prominent character in this story. Everyone that's there is a byproduct of death, which goes to the sinful fall. We definitely get that, but also like there was a war that took away her first love. Like that's broken. Sure. That thing. That's a part of the story. Like even when she does the archives and she doesn't want to see that scene where he goes off to war. Like it's a pretty like sad moment because
it is. Yeah,
you can kind of feel for her. Like she had this love, and they keep on talking about how handsome he is, how perfect he is. This like this catch, right? And then he goes off to war. I don't know if he was drafted or if he was already in the military or whatever. But they don't really get into that kind of background. But that in and of itself, the war between the Koreans, the Communist War,
Yeah.
which then later on led to Vietnam War. That is a part of the brokenness of the world, like that kind of that
Yeah.
takes people like men prominently away from their lives. I don't know if you know anyone that
Well,
died in war and got taken away from his.
yeah, I know people that have died. Certainly with Iraq and Afghanistan. That's terrible. Uh, the other part of that brokenness that you mentioned, while they build Luke up continually, he's so good looking. He's such a great guy. He's got his stuff together, and he was ripped away from her, too soon. Uh, you know, he doesn't end up being so perfect either once she ends up with him, in the world that he chooses. And I think that's another example of the brokenness of people.
Yeah, even after death,
Yeah.
which speaks to kind of the immaturity of like the idea of the afterlife, which popular culture likes to build, and the good place does the same thing, where you get this perfect paradise, you get to do the things that you really want to do. Like they go skiing, they even mention like fresh powder today, like that comment was made, and she's like, "I'm good, like
Yeah.
I've done it
Had enough
enough."
powder.
I've had enough powder, which I thought was I think that just shows like an immature understanding of afterlife or heaven. Is
Yeah.
this idea of being able to do like what you want to do every
Yeah.
as often as you want to, and
Well,
she gets bored with it, and she gets bored with him.
it's that self-centeredness that
Yeah,
I mentioned. The afterlife is all about me.
right.
And this is kind of neat too. How often do you see little anecdotes online about these feel good little memes or whatever, where it talks about how when you die and everybody's waiting to greet you, and you see your old dog come running across a field, and it's me, 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 me. But you know this will get into what we talk about a little later, of the purpose of marriage and life and death. But it's not about me, right? We got to take the focus off of ourselves. And I think that it leads into a little bit of what is the purpose of marriage beyond just simply procreating.
Yep.
And why do we spend eternity with God when we die? It's not about enjoying fresh powder and being with the people you love on earth. I think there's a different reason for that, and I think that gets a little bit lost when you step away from um, your view as a Christian, or a view as just a secular guy living in the world.
Like you should have like fake advertisement. This is brought to you by Apple TV. You get $12.99 a month. So why don't we just go there, because I think that is actually like, again, it's like we talked about with Argo. Like I think the writer of the story, the director, probably this was not in the back of their minds, but it definitely, like when you watch the movie, you're like, dude, this basically presents like the challenge of like what happens when you've been married multiple times and you go to the afterlife.
Yeah,
Like, I mean, it brings
yeah,
up a fascinating, because it is interesting, and I think it does present some of the shallowness of people's understanding of heaven. And I would even include Christians in this mix, who basically
yeah,
think of heaven as basically hanging out with your loved ones, which
yep,
and it presents this idea of like, well, if that's the case, there's going to be some interesting predicaments in heaven if that's what life is all about. So I'll just mention it here, and I won't read the whole story. But in Matthew 22:30, the Pharisees challenge Jesus on the concept of like, all right, if a man marries a woman and he dies, and
hmm
she marries her brother, and then he dies, and onward and onward and onward, in heaven or in the afterlife, who is she married to? And Jesus says, for in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. That's kind of how he ends. Basically saying, like, there will be no marriage in heaven. And basically, you were not created to just be married. Like, that's not the purpose of life. But yeah, I know
yeah,
that was something you really wanted to talk about. Like,
yeah.
what is the purpose of marriage?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to take away from marriage is that well, for starters, our life on Earth is like we're corrupted, right? Um, and we're incomplete. Um, but I think marriage is a symbol for Christ's relationship to the church,
Right.
right? Um, and while it does have the benefit of raising children, of companionship, of having a partner in life, there's a lot of joy that comes along with that. It's part of probably God's common grace for
Right.
those, because even non-believers get married and have fulfilling lives. I think it gives us an expectation of what we can experience, once we die, and you know so if we're neither given in marriage, or retain our spouses, and in heaven, like, why is that? And I think because the purpose of marriage, a purpose of our existence, of our marriages, of our eternal souls, is not to be fulfilling to ourselves, but to enjoy God forever. And I think that relationship, in maybe like a glorified state of the Christian person, we don't need those things once we die. Like, marriage fulfills a purpose on earth. It certainly is fulfilling, in a good marriage, but the when we die, that's not a thing that we need anymore. You know, um, in this movie, it's made marriage, the relationship between the husband and wife, the end rather than a means.
Right. Yeah, I think that's well said. And I do like. I think it's just hard for us because being married, we're so tied to our wives, and like it. So much of our life is in
Yeah.
our.
It's a good thing
It's a
while
good
we're here.
and I think where the movie, again, it's not the right. I mean, we're assuming the director and the writer are not Christians, but there's an understanding. There's not a lack of understanding of the redeemed soul. So,
Mm,
like, the soul that is redeemed, and then of course when the when the human dies, the body is in the ground. The soul, goes to be with the Lord. We see that with the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, right? The soul, one going to heaven, one going to
yeah.
hell. The separation, and there, but you can tell, like, when it's not like our who we are, the self-centered individual on earth is not the same in heaven. Like, there's
Yeah.
been a full transformation, and so the self-centeredness, which I think is a prominent thing we've been talking about, goes away. That self-centeredness dissipates. So, like, we're not thinking, like, in heaven, like, oh, what are the things that I desperately need to be satisfied? When we're with the Lord, there is the satisfied soul, right? And I think why I think we probably struggle with this concept is because we see in the garden that Adam was incomplete without Eve, right? He was alone. He was, and God said that was not good for him to be alone, so he gave him Eve. Which it presents like an interesting concept of, like, okay, he was in the garden with Eve, they were sinless, and they walked with
Mm,
God, but then now, like, there won't be marriage in heaven. Like, you wonder, like, what's the difference and change? And I think it does present somewhat an interesting question of mystery of, like, okay, why
yeah.
can't there be marriage in heaven? But Jesus is pretty clear, though, in the Bible. He's like, there is no marriage in heaven. Period. And, like, it doesn't, like,
I,
he doesn't go off and say, here's the reasons why. He just kind of says
well, do you
there.
think it has something to do with the difference between our state in heaven versus like Adam's state? Because Adam does get a wife, and if we think about justification, sanctification, glorification, kind of in that order, if we are, like, say we're sanctified, we have no desire to sin, but an inability to not sin. And while we're on earth, you get to a glorified state in heaven where you have no desire to sin, no ability to sin. Adam was not in a glorified state, I would say, right? In Genesis, he had the ability to sin, and he did. You know, have you ever heard of? I read a book that was talking about the problem of evil, and it mentioned the monomyth. Is that something we've talked about before? I can't remember. Where monomyth meaning one story, and you see this reflected a lot in scripture, where it's over and over again if you look for it, where there's people are at a certain state and a condition, they sin and fall short, and then God redeems and makes it better at the end state than it was at the beginning. And I think one of the pictures that scripture describes at the end of all things is that we're justified. Yeah, where scripture describes where we are existing in a certain state where we are trusting in Christ. We are justified, being sanctified. That the end state of all things is that we are in a glorified state where we have no desire to sin, no ability to sin, and it's better. Our position, our station will be better than Adam had in the garden. It's a redeemed, restored reality. And maybe in that way, where Christ says there's no marriage and in heaven, that could be something along those lines.
Yeah, and I think you were right when we were first talking about this. Like, the purpose of marriage is to reflect the love of
Yeah,
Christ to the church. Well, that's not needed, like, because the bride is with the groom, right? And that's like,
yeah,
we see that in the
yeah,
marriage
yeah,
supper of the Lamb, and I think too often, especially with men, I think this is just the truth. We connect marriage with sex, like, and procreation, this type
yeah.
of matter. And I think men are uncomfortable with this discussion because they're like, "Oh, I'm not a bride." Like, that concept
Oh,
I think
yeah,
it's hard for men. But again, like, we were not created to have sex either. Like, that wasn't our purpose to be. Nor were
yeah.
women, created to just be married and be with their husband and to have children. Like, that is
Yeah.
a part of life. It's a joy.
It
It's like you
is.
said, a common grace, but it's not the purpose of life. And I think that's where
I
this
agree.
movie
I
totally,
agree.
like, misses it, because, like,
Yeah.
it's an
Well, it
interesting
loses
concept.
the forest for the trees, right? We take this micro part of our existence and make that the whole thing when there's a whole bigger picture that is missed.
So let
So,
me ask you, regardless of that, do you think this? Where did the story, do you think the movie, reflect the gospel? Is there any reflection of the gospel in this story, do you think?
well, man, if we're talking about uh, like a Christ figure, self-sacrificial, to redeem and take the punishment for somebody who it's owed. I don't see an overt gospel message in this story. I don't know. Maybe you do.
No, the only thing I think it does get right is that humans live forever. Like, there's a soul, eternal
Yeah,
soul. So it's not like they go to nothing.
yeah.
Their existence continues. That goes from Ecclesiastes. God put eternity into their hearts.
Although,
You
although
sense
that
that with the story. Go
that
ahead.
annihilationism concept's been in the news a little bit too, hasn't it?
I don't know. I may have missed this. Where
No,
the
yeah, no. Who's the Christian director who this was several months ago. What's his name? I'm drawing a blank on it. It was all over Facebook for a couple of months where he said basically that I don't believe that in eternal damnation, that so the annihilationist view would be that in hell you just cease to exist, because if God is all loving, that he would not torment souls for eternity. um, and that grew some legs for a little while. I don't believe that, and I know that you don't either. That
prominent theologian pastor in England, John Stott, did. So there have been a few
yeah.
that do have
Well,
hold to that view.
that raised some interesting questions though about what does it mean when we say that God is good? Because our immediate perception of good culturally is that, like, well, a good God would not do that.
Right.
And when I think about the goodness of God, I take that as, well, God is good by nature, so therefore anything God does is good, regardless of my, gut feeling about a thing, this or the other. If I know that God's ways are higher than my own, and I don't understand everything about God or His goodness, I can trust that what He does is good, regardless of my, feelings about this particular matter or that particular matter. So
Yeah, and I think the other point, and I just remembered that this movie, I think, gets right. Even though we said that morality was relative, it did. He made the point. Luke made this point. No one's perfect. I'm not
yeah,
perfect. I've made mistakes, and I think, all right. Even though like that wasn't a prominent storyline or anything like that,
mm.
it does state this idea that no one at that in the afterlife, no one at the junction is perfect.
there are
There's
certainly some nuggets of truth that are embedded in the story. That's one of them. A second one is that even though these characters are choosing their own afterlife eternities, that they are still somehow under the umbrella of an authority that is not, necessarily interacting with them, but they still know intrinsically that they are not the ultimate masters of their destiny. Like they try to escape the destiny they choose, and
right.
someone always comes after them. Except for the
That's
very end of the movie where they do hide in a in their own eternity. I mean, kind of a way to put a neat little bow on the problem they created. But
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of unanswered questions there. I don't know if you saw that movie. It was actually a Marvel movie, Thunderbolt. But there was some of that element of like going through memories, like that.
yeah,
I don't know if that was an inspiration of this movie that kind of came out around the same time, but going through people's memories, like that was I think the newest Stranger Things season did the same thing, right? They were
yeah.
going
I love
through,
Stranger Things.
yeah, we have maybe talk about that, but going through memories was a kind of a towards the end of that movie. Like, it was as the last act of the movie was that idea and her trying to get away through memories and stuff like that. There was some stuff
Yeah.
like that end there was like I was like, where are they? Like, did they create their own eternity? Like, I that was something I didn't really understand.
Yeah.
She goes, it looks like Oakdale, which is perfect,
Yeah.
which I guess is like the community they lived in. But like, I'm like, what? Where was? I don't know. They didn't really give a flash of that at any point in the
Yeah.
movie. Like that was an existence they could have chose. I don't know. That was one kind of like I was kind of like, where are they? Anyways, but I was, I don't think it was a movie I probably would have picked unless you had suggested it. So I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
I laughed quite a few times. I think mostly through the different eternities that were offered that really
Yeah.
cracked me up. Like I was
Yeah.
crackling up pretty well. But yeah, would you recommend this to someone like?
Oh
To
yeah.
recommended it to me. I think it's one of those movies where it was the same with The Good Place. Like you would hear people say, "I didn't like The Good Place," and I'm like, "Interesting, you didn't like it," because I
I've
think there
never
was
heard anyone say that because it's a great show.
it's a great show, but I think people's are turned off
Oh.
because, yeah, of course, it's not a Christian perspective of heaven or hell. Like, yes, that's
Mm.
but what it does is by almost it guarantees a religious conversation because it's dealing with the
Big
afterlife, the
questions.
eternal
Yeah.
soul, big questions, and I think it is actually an underused concept in
Mm.
movies that I think maybe do provide some really good like spiritual conversations that maybe other movies or TV
Yeah.
shows wouldn't because it's so clearly like like The Good Place is a good example. Well, what is the good place and how do you get there? Do you have to be like
Yeah.
really like moral? How could it be moral? And those are all great questions that like for us as Christians, like these are great discussions.
Another one is Upload from Amazon. Have you seen that?
Oh, I haven't.
Ooh. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That's it's kind the good. It's an after death kind of movie, but that show is worth watching on Amazon.
All right. So
There's a few seasons.
so we've got if we do this round robin of I pick one, you pick one. I think because it was on your list that you sent me, we'll have to do Sicario next because
Yeah.
it is a man. We talk about from this movie to that movie, like it doesn't get
Yeah.
much darker. And
Yeah.
even the cinematography is dark. So we'll have to
Mhm.
do that one next, and
Sure.
that will be a great one. So thanks for getting on here while in China. By the way, this is
Yeah.
epic. Safe travels back home, and it's great to be able to kind of dissect movies. And again, like the slogan for this podcast is "Citizens of Heaven at the Movies." Like being able to watch movies like this and being able to analyze them from a Christian worldview, and then hopefully talk about them with people who are watching movies. Like, have you seen Eternity?
I
What do you
agree.
think of it? That kind of thing. I think provides a
Yeah.
great opportunity for evangelism. Anything else you want to mention before we get off?
No, I just think that the value in these type of things where we can watch these movies that don't have our shared worldview, it allows you to look at this and really understand what the movie's telling you about a thing without just, if it's a convincing story, just to accept that as a, oh well, this must be, this truth concept must be a real thing because it makes sense in the story. Well, if we can be grounded in the things that we know to be true, then we can look at a story and not necessarily pick it apart, but it allows us to evaluate our own worldviews and understandings against different perspectives, and I think it can help strengthen a person's faith. Even though the movie itself might not subscribe to that same system.
Oh, that's a great point. And art provides a great opportunity for us to talk about concepts and ideas and things that are happening in our world, but it provides a safer place to talk about them.
Yeah.
So thanks for listening to Logos Theater 3000. If the episode helped you see the film more clearly or the gospel more beautifully, share it with friends, leave a review, and join us next time as we trace these themes that are happening in the movies that we watch, and how really we see gospel stories being presented in mainstream films. So thanks for joining, Bill, and hopefully we'll do this again very soon, talking about Sicario.
Right on.
Thanks, man.
All right.